The dust came without mercy, turning the afternoon sky the color of rust and blood, and Zachary Vance learned in that moment what it meant to die alone. He had been riding toward Pueblo, Colorado for 3 days straight, following rumors of work at the railroad yards, when the storm hit like a wall of grit and fury. His horse had bolted an hour ago, spooked by thunder that never brought rain, leaving him stumbling through a landscape he could no longer see. Each breath felt like swallowing broken glass. The bandana he had tied around his face had fallen somewhere behind him, lost to the wind that screamed across the flatlands with a voice like 1,000 angry spirits. Zachary dropped to his knees, coughing so hard he tasted copper. He was 24 years old and had survived the war, survived his father's fists, survived winters that froze men solid in their bedrolls. But this storm was different. This storm did not care about survival. It only cared about erasure. He pressed his hands into the dirt, trying to anchor himself, but the world spun regardless. Another coughing fit tore through him, violent and unrelenting. His lungs burned. His eyes streamed tears that turned instantly to mud on his cheeks. Then something soft pressed against his face. Fabric. Cool and damp. Someone wrapped it around his nose and mouth, tying it firmly at the back of his head. Through the haze of dust and pain, he felt hands on his shoulders, small hands but strong. They pulled him forward, guiding him when he could barely see his own boots. He stumbled, and those hands caught him. He tried to speak, to ask who was there, but the cloth muffled his words and another cough rattled through his chest. The hands did not let go. Whoever it was stayed beside him, one arm hooked through his, leading him through the screaming wind. Zachary had no idea how long they walked. Time became meaningless in the storm. There was only the next step, and the next, and the presence beside him that refused to leave. His legs threatened to give out twice, but each time his unknown companion braced him, taking some of his weight, keeping him upright and moving. When they finally reached shelter, it came as a shock. One moment they were in hell, the next they were stumbling through a doorway into sudden stillness. The door slammed shut behind them, muffling the storm's roar to a distant howl. Zachary collapsed onto his hands and knees, coughing so violently he thought his ribs might crack. The cloth stayed on his face, filtering the air, and gradually, painfully, his breathing began to settle. "Easy now," a voice said. A woman's voice, low and steady. "Take your time, you are safe." Zachary looked up, blinking dust from his eyes. The world slowly came into focus. He was in a small adobe structure, sparsely furnished but sturdy. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars and tools he could not quite make out in the dim light. A single window, shuttered tight against the storm. And standing above him, reaching for a canteen, was the woman who had saved his life. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes the color of creek water in summer. Her dress was simple, faded blue calico covered by a leather apron, and her hands were stained with what looked like plant residue. She uncorked the canteen and held it out to him. "Small sips," she said. "Your throat will be raw." He took the canteen with shaking hands and drank. The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals. It soothed the fire in his throat just enough for him to croak out a question. "Who are you?" "Adelaide Torres," she said. "And you are lucky I was checking my herb garden when I saw you stumbling around like a drunk steer." "Zachary Vance," he managed between coughs. "I am grateful. You saved my life." Adelaide knelt beside him, studying his face with the calm assessment of someone used to making quick decisions. "Can you breathe properly now?" he nodded, though his chest still felt tight. "Better than before." "Good. Keep that cloth on for another hour at least." The dust will settle in your lungs otherwise. She stood and moved to one of the shelves, pulling down a jar filled with dried leaves. I will make you something to help with the cough. Zachary watched her work, too exhausted to do much else. She moved with efficiency, measuring herbs into a small pot, adding water from a barrel in the corner, setting it over a tiny iron stove that somehow vented through the thick adobe walls. The storm continued to rage outside, but in here, there was order. There was purpose. Adelaide Torres clearly knew what she was doing. "What brings you to Pueblo?" she asked as she worked, not looking at him. "Work," Zachary said. "Heard they were hiring at the railroad." "They are always hiring at the railroad," Adelaide replied, "because men keep dying there, accidents, cave-ins. Sometimes just the heat and the labor." She glanced over her shoulder at him. "Is that really what you want?" Zachary did not have a good answer. What he wanted was to eat regularly, to have a roof over his head that did not leak, to stop drifting from town to town like tumbleweeds. But he supposed all that was just another way of saying he wanted to survive, and survival often meant taking dangerous work. "It is what I can get," he said finally. Adelaide made a soft sound that might have been understanding or might have been disapproval. She stirred the pot, and soon a bitter, medicinal smell filled the small room. When it was ready, she poured some of the dark liquid into a tin cup and brought it to him. "Drink it all," she instructed. "It tastes terrible, but it will help." She was right on both counts. The tea tasted like dirt and despair, but almost immediately, Zachary felt his chest loosening. The tight, painful sensation that had gripped his lungs since the storm hit began to ease. He drank every drop and handed the cup back to her. "What is in that?" he asked. "Mullein, mostly. Some other things." Adelaide took the cup and set it aside. "I am an herbalist. People come to me when they are sick or hurt and do not trust the town doctor." "Why would they not trust the doctor?" "Because he drinks more than he heals, and he charges 3 times what I do." Adelaide returned to the stove, ladling more tea into a jar. "You can have the rest of this. Drink it twice a day until your cough is gone completely." Zachary pushed himself up to sit against the wall, feeling marginally more human. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask you to. Still, I owe you my life. That is not a debt I take lightly." Adelaide turned to look at him fully for the first time since they had entered the shelter. Her gaze was direct, assessing. "You want to repay me. Stay here until the storm passes." "I could use help moving some supplies before nightfall, and you look strong enough to be useful." It was not really a question, but Zachary nodded anyway. "I can do that." The storm raged for another 3 hours. In that time, Adelaide explained that this was not her home but a storage shed she maintained on the outskirts of Pueblo, where she grew herbs and kept supplies away from the dust and noise of town. Her actual residence was a small house near the plaza, but she came out here most days to tend her garden and prepare medicines. "It is quieter," she said, arranging jars on a high shelf while Zachary held a lantern for her. "In town, people are always knocking on my door. Someone's child has a fever, someone's husband cut his hand, someone's grandmother cannot sleep. Out here I can think." "You do not like helping people?" Zachary asked. "I love helping people," Adelaide corrected. "But I also need silence sometimes. Everyone does." When the wind finally died down and the sky began to clear, Adelaide opened the door to reveal a landscape transformed. Dust covered everything in a thick, reddish layer. Her garden, which had been visible before, was now buried. She sighed, a sound of deep weariness, and picked up a shovel. "This will take days to fix," she said. Zachary took the shovel from her hands. "Then I had better get started." She blinked at him. "You do not have to do that. I told you small help with the supplies was enough." "You saved my life," Zachary said simply. A few hours of work does not balance that scale, but maybe a few days will start to. Adelaide studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "All right then. But you will need a place to stay. The boarding houses in town are overpriced and full of bedbugs. You can use my shed here. It is not much, but it is clean and dry." That was how Zachary Vance came to spend the late summer of 1878 on the outskirts of Pueblo, digging Adelaide Torres's herb garden out from under a mountain of dust. The work was back-breaking, but after the first day, his cough had eased enough that he could breathe without pain. After the second day, he began to see the shape of what the garden had been before the storm. After the third day, Adelaide joined him, working alongside him with a determination that matched his own. They did not talk much at first. Adelaide was focused and quiet, directing him where to dig, what to save, what to discard. But on the fourth day, as they sat in the shade of the adobe shed eating a simple lunch of bread and cheese, she asked him about the war. "You were a soldier," she said. It was not a question. Zachary wiped his mouth and nodded. "For 3 years, cavalry." "Which side?" "Union." "I was 16 when I enlisted," lied about my age. Adelaide tore off a piece of bread and chewed thoughtfully. "My father fought for the South. He died at Shiloh when I was 8 years old." Zachary felt a complicated knot of emotions twist in his chest. Guilt, grief, the strange survivor's shame that followed him everywhere. "I am sorry. It was a long time ago." Adelaide's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was an old pain underneath it. "My mother brought me here to Colorado afterward. She wanted to be somewhere new, somewhere without memories. She died 5 years later from consumption. After that, it was just me. No other family, none that would claim me. My mother's people disowned her when she married a Confederate soldier. My father's people blamed her for his death, said she should have stopped him from going." Adelaide shrugged. "So I learned to take care of myself. A woman in town taught me about herbs when I was 14. By the time I was 18, I knew more than she did. Now I am the one people come to." Zachary looked at her with new respect. Adelaide Torres had been alone since she was 17, surviving in a rough frontier town through skill and stubborn determination. She had every reason to be hard and bitter, but instead she had walked into a dust storm to save a stranger. "Why did you come after me?" he asked. "You could have waited out the storm safely." Adelaide met his eyes. "Because I know what it is like to be alone, and because I could." Something shifted in Zachary's chest, a feeling he could not quite name. He had spent so many years drifting, belonging nowhere, needed by no one. Adelaide's simple statement, "because I could," carried a weight that surprised him. She had seen someone in trouble and acted, not because she expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. In Zachary's experience, that kind of decency was rare. Over the following weeks, the garden slowly came back to life. Zachary proved to be more than just strong. He was observant, learning quickly which plants were which, understanding what Adelaide needed before she had to ask. He built a new fence to keep out rabbits and fixed the shed's roof where it had started to leak. In return, Adelaide fed him, treated the various scrapes and bruises he accumulated, and gradually, cautiously, led him into her world. She showed him how to identify mullein by its fuzzy leaves, how to harvest lavender without bruising the stems, how to prepare willow bark for pain relief. Zachary, who had spent most of his life learning how to hurt rather than heal, found the work strangely satisfying. There was something profound about growing things, about taking care instead of taking lives. One evening, as they sat outside the shed watching the sun set over the distant mountains, Adelaide said, "You never went to the railroad." Zachary had almost forgotten about that. The job he had come to Pueblo for seemed less important now. No, he admitted. Why not? He considered the question carefully. I suppose I found something better. Adelaide glanced at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Digging in the dirt for no pay, learning something worthwhile, being useful, not being alone. Zachary hesitated, then added, being around someone I respect. The smile faded into something more serious. Zachary, you cannot stay here forever. This is not a life. You need real work, real money. Why? The question came out more forcefully than he had intended. Adelaide, I have spent 8 years chasing real work and real money. All it has gotten me is scars and loneliness. What you are teaching me here matters more than anything I have learned in twice that time. But it does not pay, Adelaide said quietly, and winter is coming. I can feed one person on what I make. I cannot feed two. The practical reality of her words stung, but Zachary could not argue with them. He had no money, no prospects beyond this temporary arrangement. Adelaide had been generous, but generosity had limits. He would have to leave eventually, find work, move on. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone. I know, he said finally. I will go into town tomorrow, look for something. Adelaide nodded but said nothing more. They sat in silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple, and Zachary tried not to think about how much he dreaded leaving this small patch of earth they had reclaimed together. The next morning, he rode Adelaide's spare mule into Pueblo proper. The town had grown since the railroad arrived, sprawling outward in a chaotic mix of adobe, wood frame, and canvas structures. The main street was a river of activity. Freight wagons, riders, pedestrians dodging horse manure and construction debris. Zachary tied the mule outside a general store and started asking about work. The railroad was still hiring, but the foreman was a hard-eyed man who looked Zachary over and offered wages so low they were barely worth the risk. The livery stable needed help, but the owner wanted someone who could shoe horses, a skill Zachary lacked. The saloons were always looking for muscle to break up fights, but Zachary had promised himself he was done with violence for hire. By midday, he was frustrated and discouraged. He stopped at a small restaurant for a meal he could barely afford and was just finishing his coffee when he overheard 2 men talking at the next table. Torres, you said? One asked. Yeah, the herb woman. Lives out past the old mission. What about her? Heard she has been keeping some drifter out there. Folks are starting to talk. Zachary's hand tightened on his cup. The other man laughed, a nasty sound. Can't say I blame her. Woman living alone like that, she probably gets lonely. Still, it is not decent. The first man shrugged. Decent or not, it is her business. Though if she is not careful, she will get a reputation. Zachary stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The 2 men glanced at him, then away, uninterested. He left money on the table and walked out, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He had been naive. Of course people would talk. Of course Adelaide's reputation would suffer. He was an unmarried man living on her property, eating her food, working her land. In a town like this, that was enough to ruin a woman's standing. He rode back to the shed faster than was wise, his mind racing. When he arrived, Adelaide was bent over a table, grinding something in a stone mortar. She looked up as he dismounted. That was quick, she said. Did you find anything? I found out that people in town are gossiping about you, Zachary said bluntly. About us. Adelaide's expression did not change. I know. You know, and you did not think to mention it. Why would I? People always gossip. It is what they do when their own lives are boring. Adelaide went back to her grinding. It does not matter. It does matter. Zachary crossed to her, forcing her to look at him. Adelaide, your reputation matters. Your business depends on it. If people think you are improper, they will stop coming to you. Then they will come back when they need me badly enough, Adelaide said calmly. I am the best healer in 50 miles, and everyone knows it. They can gossip all they want, but when their children are sick, they will still knock on my door. She was probably right, but that did not ease Zachary's conscience. I should leave. Go find work somewhere else. I have imposed on you long enough. Adelaide set down her mortar with more force than necessary. Is that what you want, to leave? The question stopped him cold. What did he want? A month ago, the answer would have been simple. A job, a wage, survival. But standing here in this small adobe structure that smelled of herbs and earth, looking at Adelaide Torres with her steady green eyes and her stubborn chin, Zachary realized his answer had changed. No, he admitted. I do not want to leave. Then stop being noble and help me sort these roots. Zachary stared at her. Adelaide, I am trying to protect you. I do not need protecting. I need a partner. She said the word deliberately, watching his reaction. Someone who understands this work, who can help me gather and prepare and sell. Someone I trust. That person could be you if you stopped worrying about what ignorant people think and started thinking about what we could build together. The implication of her words hung in the air between them. A partner, not an employee, not a temporary helper, but an equal. It was more than Zachary had dared to hope for. You are serious, he said. I am always serious. Adelaide picked up a root and handed it to him. This is devil's claw, good for inflammation. You separate the claws like this, then dry them on racks. Can you do that? Zachary took the root, his hand briefly touching hers. Yes. Good. Then we will figure out the rest as we go. They did not speak about it again that day, but something had shifted between them. When Adelaide came out to the shed in the evenings, she stayed longer, talking about her plans to expand the garden, to sell her remedies to mining camps in the mountains, to maybe write down her recipes so the knowledge would not die with her. Zachary listened and contributed his own ideas, and slowly they began to sound less like separate people and more like a unit. A partnership, just as Adelaide had said. As September turned to October, the weather cooled and the work intensified. They harvested the last of the summer herbs and planted winter crops. Adelaide taught Zachary how to make tinctures and salves, how to recognize when a patient needed a doctor despite their protests, how to balance accounts and negotiate prices with merchants who thought they could cheat a woman. In return, Zachary handled the heavier physical labor, built shelves and drying racks, and accompanied Adelaide into town so she would not have to walk alone after dark. It was during one of those evening walks, as they returned from delivering medicine to a family on the far side of Pueblo, that they encountered trouble. 3 men stepped out of an alley, clearly drunk, blocking their path. Zachary recognized one of them from the restaurant, one of the men who had been gossiping. "Evening, Miss Torres," the man said, his words slurred. "Out late with your hired man." "Good evening, Mr. Fletcher," Adelaide replied coolly. "Please step aside." Fletcher did not move. His companions grinned, emboldened by alcohol and cruelty. "Awful friendly with your help, are you not? Makes a man wonder what else you are teaching him besides herbs." Zachary stepped forward, putting himself between Adelaide and the 3 men. "You will apologize to the lady and move on," he said quietly. His voice was level, but there was steel underneath it, the kind of tone that men who had been in war recognized instinctively. Fletcher's grin faltered. He was drunk, but not drunk enough to miss the danger in Zachary's stance. "Now hold on, I was just making conversation." "No, you were being disrespectful. Apologize." One of Fletcher's companions, braver or stupider than his friend, put a hand on Zachary's chest. "Or what? You going to fight all 3 of us, Drifter?" Zachary looked down at the hand, then back up at the man's face. If I have to. For a moment, violence hung in the air like a held breath. Then Adelaide's voice cut through the tension. Enough. She stepped around Zachary, looking each of the three men in the eye. Mr. Fletcher, Mr. Dobbs, Mr. Green, I have treated each of your families at one time or another. I set your daughter's broken arm, Mr. Fletcher. I cured your son's croup, Mr. Dobbs. I sat with your mother through her final illness, Mr. Green. Is this how you repay kindness? By accosting me in the street, the three men had the grace to look ashamed. Fletcher's face reddened. Miss Torres, I did not mean nothing by it. You meant exactly what you said. You just did not expect to be called on it. Adelaide's voice was calm, but disappointment dripped from every word. I expected better from you. Clearly I was wrong. Now move aside. They moved. Zachary and Adelaide walked past them in silence, and the three men did not follow. When they were safely out of earshot, Zachary let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. You handled that well, he said. I have had practice. Adelaide's voice was tired. Men like that are all bluster. They would never actually hurt me. They are just mean enough to say cruel things. But thank you for standing up for me. Always, Zachary said, and meant it with a ferocity that surprised him. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, but when they reached the shed, Adelaide did not immediately say good night as she usually did. Instead, she turned to face him, her expression serious in the moonlight. Zachary, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. All right. Are you staying here because you want to, or because you feel obligated? The question struck at something deep inside him. Zachary thought about the past 2 months, about learning to tell yarrow from chamomile, about the satisfaction of fixing Adelaide's leaking roof, about the way she laughed when he made a mistake, and the way she trusted him with tasks that mattered. He thought about how, for the first time in years, he woke up each morning knowing exactly where he belonged. I am staying because I want to, he said, because I have never felt more at home anywhere than I do here with you. Adelaide's eyes searched his face. Even though it means people will talk, even though you could make more money elsewhere, I do not care about any of that. Zachary took a step closer. Adelaide, you are the most remarkable person I have ever met. You are strong and smart and kind in a world that does not reward kindness. You saved my life, and then you gave me a reason to be glad you did. If you will have me, I want to stay. Not as your hired help or your burden, but as your partner in every sense of the word. Adelaide's breath caught. Every sense? Yes. Zachary reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. I am in love with you. I think I have been since you wrapped that cloth around my face and refused to let me die alone in a dust storm. For a moment, Adelaide said nothing. Then she smiled, a real smile that lit up her entire face. Good, because I have been in love with you since you took my shovel and spent a week digging out my garden for no reason except that you said you owed me. Zachary laughed, relief and joy flooding through him. We are both fools then. Probably. Adelaide squeezed his hand. But at least we are fools together. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she might disappear if he was too rough. Adelaide kissed him back with a certainty that left no doubt about her feelings. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, she rested her forehead against his. People really will talk now, she murmured. Let them, Zachary said. As long as I have you, I do not care what anyone else thinks. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Pueblo. Adelaide wore a dress the color of sage, and Zachary wore the only suit he owned, brushed clean and mended where it had torn. The priest who married them was a practical man who did not ask too many questions and did not judge them for their short courtship. A handful of Adelaide's patients attended. People who had known her long enough to trust her judgment, and a few men Zachary had met while looking for work came to shake his hand and welcome him to town. The biggest surprise came from an elderly Mexican woman named Doña Maria, who had been Adelaide's first teacher in herbalism. She arrived at the church with a basket covered in cloth and pressed it into Adelaide's hands after the ceremony. "You are a good girl," Doña Maria said in Spanish, which Zachary was slowly learning to understand. "You deserve happiness. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Inside the basket were herbs for fertility, dried flowers for luck, and a beautiful rebozo woven in shades of blue and green. Adelaide hugged the old woman tightly, tears streaming down her face, and Zachary understood that this simple gesture meant more to his new wife than anything else that day. They spent their wedding night in Adelaide's house in town, a small two-room adobe structure that was now officially theirs together. It was modest but clean, with Adelaide's personality evident in every corner. Jars of herbs on every shelf, bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling, books stacked beside the bed. Zachary felt like he had stepped into the heart of who she was, and the trust implicit in that made his chest tight with emotion. "Are you happy?" Adelaide asked as they lay together afterward, her head on his chest, his arms around her. "More than I ever thought possible," Zachary said honestly. "You have given me everything I did not know I needed. You have given me the same." Adelaide traced patterns on his skin with her fingertips. "I never thought I would marry. I had convinced myself I was content alone. But then you stumbled into my life half dead from dust, and everything changed. Lucky for me, you are terrible at minding your own business." She laughed and swatted his shoulder playfully. "Lucky for you, I am a better person than you deserve." "That is absolutely true." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when Zachary woke in the morning to find Adelaide already up and brewing coffee, he had the profound realization that this was his life now. Not a temporary stop between disasters, not a way station on the road to somewhere else, but home. Permanent, solid home. The first year of their marriage brought challenges neither of them had anticipated. Combining their lives meant navigating differences they had not noticed during courtship. Adelaide was meticulous and organized, while Zachary tended toward chaos. He was an early riser who liked to work at dawn, while she preferred staying up late to read or prepare medicines. They argued about money, about how much to charge for treatments, about whether they should save or reinvest in expanding the business. But they also learned how to fight fair, how to apologize sincerely, how to compromise without resentment. Adelaide taught Zachary patience with difficult customers. Zachary taught Adelaide that it was all right to turn people away sometimes, that she did not have to heal the whole world at the expense of her own health. They grew together, becoming something stronger than either had been alone. By the spring of 1879, their partnership had evolved into something truly remarkable. Word of their skills spread beyond Pueblo, and people began traveling from mining camps and ranches miles away to buy Adelaide's remedies or seek Zachary's advice on treating livestock ailments. He had discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that many of the principles Adelaide used for humans worked equally well on animals, and the ranchers appreciated having someone who understood both. They bought a small wagon and began making rounds to the more remote areas, bringing medicine to people who could not easily come to town. It was hard work, often dangerous, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Zachary had never imagined he could make a living by helping people rather than hurting them, and the change in how he saw himself was profound. One evening in June, as they camped beside a creek on their way back from a mining settlement, Adelaide told him she was pregnant. Zachary had been checking the wagon's wheel, which had developed a worrying wobble, and he froze with his hands still on the spokes. "You are certain?" "I am an herbalist, Zachary. I know the signs." Adelaide smiled at him, nervous but hopeful. "Are you pleased?" He crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground in a spinning embrace that made her laugh. "Pleased? Adelaide, I am terrified and thrilled and more happy than I can possibly express." "Good. Because we have approximately 7 months to figure out how to keep a tiny human alive." They spent the rest of that evening making plans, arguing amiably about names, and trying not to worry too much about all the things that could go wrong. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, and they both knew women who had died bringing children into the world. But Adelaide was healthy and strong, and she knew more about midwifery than most doctors. If anyone could manage, it would be her. As her pregnancy progressed, Zachary became almost comically protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy lifting, would not let her ride the wagon over rough terrain, and fretted whenever she stayed on her feet too long. Adelaide tolerated this for about 2 months before she sat him down and explained in exasperated detail that pregnancy was not an illness and she was perfectly capable of working. "I understand you are worried," she said, taking his hands, "but you need to trust me to know my own limits. If I need help, I will ask." "Deal, deal," Zachary agreed reluctantly, "but I reserve the right to hover anxiously from a distance. I would expect nothing less." Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1880, arriving 3 weeks early and wailing with the fury of someone deeply offended by the world. Doña Maria served as midwife, with Zachary pacing outside until Adelaide yelled at him to get in there and be useful. He held her hand through the worst of it, whispered encouragement when she was too exhausted to push any more, and caught his son when he finally slipped into the world, tiny and perfect and absolutely terrifying. "He is so small," Zachary breathed, staring at the baby in his arms. "He will grow," Adelaide said, exhausted but smiling. "What should we name him?" They had debated this for months without reaching a conclusion. Now, looking at his son's scrunched-up face, Zachary knew exactly what felt right. "Samuel, after my brother who died in the war." Adelaide's eyes softened with understanding. "Samuel Vance. It is perfect." Fatherhood changed Zachary in ways he had not anticipated. The fierce protectiveness he felt for Adelaide extended to Samuel tenfold. Every cry sent him rushing to the cradle, certain something was catastrophically wrong. Every cough convinced him the baby was gravely ill. Adelaide, more pragmatic, reminded him that infants cried and coughed and survived it all just fine, but Zachary could not help himself. This tiny person was his responsibility, his to protect, and the weight of that was both crushing and exhilarating. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Zachary discovered the profound joy of watching someone discover the world. Samuel's first laugh, his first word, his first unsteady steps, all of it filled Zachary with a pride so intense it was almost painful. He taught Samuel to identify herbs before the boy could properly talk, carried him around the garden on his shoulders, told him stories about Adelaide's bravery in the dust storm that had brought them together. Adelaide watched them with amusement and love, and sometimes, late at night, she would tell Zachary how grateful she was that their son would grow up knowing his father. "My father is just a name to me," she said once. "A man who died before I could remember him, but Samuel will know you. He will remember this." "I will make sure of it," Zachary promised. When Samuel was 2, they expanded the house, adding a proper bedroom for him and a larger workspace for Adelaide's medicine making. The business was thriving enough that they could afford lumber and hire help with the construction. Zachary did most of the work himself, with Samuel, helping by handing him nails one at a time and getting in the way only toddlers could. By 1883, Pueblo had grown into a proper city. The railroad had brought prosperity, steel mills had opened, and the population had nearly tripled. Their practice grew with it. Adelaide trained 2 apprentices, young women from town who wanted to learn healing, and Zachary organized a network of suppliers to ensure they always had the herbs and materials they needed. They had become, against all odds, pillars of the community. People respected Adelaide's knowledge and trusted Zachary's judgment. The gossip that had once threatened Adelaide's reputation had faded into irrelevance, replaced by stories of lives saved and suffering eased. They were no longer the herb woman and the drifter. They were the Vances, healers and partners, and everyone knew their name. In the fall of that year, Adelaide told Zachary she was pregnant again. This time he managed to control his anxiety somewhat better, though he still fussed more than she appreciated. Their daughter was born in May of 1884, arriving in the middle of a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made Samuel cry with fear, until Adelaide let him hold his baby sister. "She is wrinkly," Samuel announced, peering at her with the brutal honesty of a 4-year-old. "So were you," Adelaide said fondly. "She will smooth out." They named her Rose after the wild roses that grew along the creek near where Zachary and Adelaide had camped the night she told him about Samuel. Rose was a quieter baby than Samuel had been, more content to watch the world than to demand its attention. And Adelaide joked that she had gotten Zachary's temperament while Samuel had gotten hers. The years that followed were good ones. Not easy life on the frontier was never easy but good. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who wanted to know everything about everything. Rose developed a stubborn streak that rivaled her mother's and a laugh that could light up the darkest day. Zachary taught them both about plants and animals, about the land and how to respect it, about kindness and integrity. Adelaide taught them to read and write, to think critically, to question authority when it was wrong. In 1887, when Samuel was 7 and Rose was 3, Zachary's past caught up with him in an unexpected way. A man came to their door asking for Adelaide, but when Zachary answered, the man's face went white. "Vance," the man said. "Zachary Vance from the 3rd Cavalry." Zachary's heart sank. He recognized the man now, Martin Howell, who had served under the same commander during the war. They had not been friends, but they had fought in the same battles, survived the same horrors. "Martin," Zachary said carefully. "What brings you to Pueblo?" Martin's expression was complicated. "I am passing through to California, looking for work. I heard your name and I had to see if it was really you." He paused. "You married her." "The Mexican woman everyone was talking about," Zachary's jaw tightened. "Her name is Adelaide. She is my wife, and you will speak of her with respect." "I did not mean offense." Martin raised his hands placatingly. "I am just surprised. Last time I saw you, you were drinking yourself to death in a Kansas City saloon, swearing you would never settle down. People change. They certainly do." Martin looked past Zachary into the house, where Adelaide had appeared with Rose on her hip and Samuel peeking out from behind her skirts. "You seem happy, Vance. Honestly happy. That is more than most of us got after the war." Something in Martin's voice made Zachary's anger fade. The man looked tired, worn down by years of hard living. "Are you hungry?" Zachary asked. "We were just about to have supper. You are welcome to join us." Martin's eyes widened with surprise, then gratitude. "I would like that, thank you." They fed him and listened to his stories about the years since the war, about the jobs he had worked and the towns he had drifted through. It was a familiar narrative. Zachary had lived that same rootless existence before Adelaide. When Martin finally left, promising to write when he reached California, Adelaide turned to Zachary with a knowing look. "That could have been you," she said quietly. "I know." Zachary pulled her close, breathing in the scent of herbs and home that always clung to her. "I was so lost before I found you. Sometimes I still cannot believe how lucky I was that you walked into that dust storm." "We were both lucky," Adelaide corrected. "I was alone, too, even if I did not want to admit it. We saved each other, Zachary. Never forget that." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I could never forget." As the 1880s turned into the 1890s, Zachary and Adelaide watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness of how quickly time passed. Samuel, at 14, was already taller than his mother and showed an aptitude for both healing and business. He talked about going to medical school one day, about combining Adelaide's herbal knowledge with formal training. Rose, at 10, was fearless and adventurous, always bringing home injured animals or lost children she had found and insisted on helping. The work continued, steady and fulfilling. They had moved their practice into a larger building in town, with a proper shop front and a room in back for treating patients. The shed where Zachary had first stayed was now just a storage space, but sometimes they would go out there together, stand in the garden they had rebuilt together, and remember how it all began. "You ever regret it?" Zachary asked one such evening as they watched the sun set over the mountains. "Tying yourself to a drifter with nothing to offer but labor," Adelaide laughed and took his hand. "Zachary Vance, after 20 years of marriage, if you still think you had nothing to offer, then I have failed as a wife. You know what I mean." "I do, and the answer is no." "Not for a single moment." Adelaide leaned against him, comfortable and solid. "You gave me a partnership, a family, a life richer than anything I imagined for myself. How could I regret that?" Zachary wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "I love you, more every day somehow. Good. Because you are stuck with me until we are both ancient and gray. I am counting on it." In 1895, Samuel left for medical school in Denver, a departure that left Adelaide crying for 3 days despite her fierce pride in her son. Rose threw herself into learning everything her mother could teach her, determined to carry on the tradition of healing. Zachary, now in his early 40s, felt the weight of years in his joints but could not bring himself to slow down. There was always work to do, people to help, a life to build. One autumn day, as Zachary was preparing tinctures in the shop, a young man stumbled in, coughing violently. Dust covered his clothes and hair. There had been a small storm that morning, nothing like the one that had nearly killed Zachary 27 years earlier, but enough to cause problems. Adelaide was out on a call, so Zachary quickly wrapped a damp cloth around the young man's face, guided him to a chair, and began preparing the mullein tea that had once saved his own life. "Easy now," he said, echoing words Adelaide had spoken so long ago. "Take your time. You are safe." The young man looked at him with desperate, grateful eyes, and Zachary felt the years collapse. He knew exactly what this stranger was feeling. The terror of not being able to breathe, the loneliness of suffering alone, the overwhelming relief of finding help. He stayed with the young man until the coughing eased, gave him tea and instructions, and refused payment. "Someone did the same for me once," Zachary explained when the man protested. "Pass it forward when you can." When Adelaide returned and heard what had happened, she smiled at him with such love and understanding that Zachary's throat tightened. "You have become who I always knew you could be," she said. "The man who helps instead of hurts, the man who stays." "I learned from the best," Zachary replied. Rose married in 1898, a young railroad engineer who treated her like a queen and respected her work as a healer. Samuel graduated from medical school the same year and returned to Pueblo to open a practice that combined modern medicine with the herbal remedies his mother had perfected. The family business evolved, expanded, became something that would outlast any one of them. By 1905, Zachary and Adelaide were grandparents 3 times over, with Samuel's 2 children and Rose's daughter filling their lives with noise and joy. They had slowed down somewhat, training younger healers to take over the more physically demanding work. But they still saw patients most days and still made their rounds to remote areas when needed. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the house they had expanded and improved over decades of marriage, Adelaide said, "We have built a good life, have we not?" Zachary looked out at the garden, now tended by Rose's husband but still thriving, at the town spread out below them, at the mountains purple in the distance. He thought about the lost, angry young man he had been, stumbling through a dust storm with no hope and no future. He thought about the woman who had wrapped a cloth around his face and refused to let him die alone. He thought about everything that had grown from that single act of compassion: love, family, purpose, home. "Yes," he said, taking Adelaide's hand. "We have built the best life. And it all started because you stayed." "We both stayed," Adelaide corrected gently. "I stayed in the storm, but you stayed after. You stayed when you could have left, when it would have been easier to drift away. You chose to build something with me, and that choice mattered just as much as mine." Zachary raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, feeling the calluses earned from decades of work, the slight swelling of joints that ached in cold weather, the strength that had never faltered. "Then I suppose we both made the right choice." "The only choice that mattered," Adelaide agreed. They sat together as the sun set, 2 people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and built something beautiful from dust and determination. Around them, the life they had created hummed with quiet contentment. Children grown and thriving, grandchildren playing in the yard, a business that helped hundreds of people every year, a reputation built on compassion and competence. In the distance, they could hear Rose calling the children to supper, Samuel's voice answering from inside the house, the everyday sounds of family that had once seemed impossible to them both. Zachary tightened his hold on Adelaide's hand, and she squeezed back, a silent conversation of gratitude and love that needed no words. The dust storm still came sometimes, turning the sky red and making people cough. But Zachary and Adelaide had learned long ago that storms passed, that what mattered was who stood beside you while they raged, who wrapped cloth around your face and guided you to safety, who stayed when staying was hard. They had stayed for each other, and in staying, they had found everything. As the years continued to roll forward like the wagon wheels that had once brought sick people to their door, Zachary and Adelaide settled into the comfortable rhythm of a life well lived. The new century brought changes to Pueblo. Automobiles began appearing on streets that had once been dominated by horses. Electric lights replaced oil lamps. The world was modernizing at a pace that sometimes left them breathless. But through it all, their work remained constant and necessary. In 1910, when Zachary was 56 and Adelaide was 54, they finally agreed it was time to fully retire from active practice. Samuel had long since established himself as Pueblo's most trusted doctor, and Rose had trained several apprentices who carried on Adelaide's methods with skill and dedication. There was no longer any need for the aging couple to strain themselves with long hours and difficult cases. "I never thought I would be happy to stop working," Adelaide admitted as they packed up the last of their supplies from the shop. "But I am tired, Zachary, truly tired. "You have earned rest 1,000 times over," Zachary said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "We both have. Let the young ones carry the burden for a while." They sold the shop to one of Adelaide's best apprentices, a sharp young woman who had been studying with her for 5 years and knew the work inside and out. With the proceeds and the savings they had accumulated over decades of careful management, they bought a small piece of land on the outskirts of town, near where Adelaide's first herb garden had been. There, they built a modest house with a porch that faced the mountains and planted a garden that was for pleasure rather than profit. Their days became quieter but no less rich. Zachary still woke early, old habits dying hard, and he would sit on the porch with coffee and watch the sunrise paint the peaks gold and pink. Adelaide joined him when she woke, and they would discuss their plans for the day. What to plant, which grandchild was visiting, whether they should ride into town for supplies or simply enjoy their solitude. The grandchildren came often, drawn by Adelaide's stories and the cookies she always seemed to have ready. She taught them about plants and patience, about how the smallest seed could become something magnificent with care and time. Zachary taught them about perseverance, about how storms passed but what you built endured, about the importance of staying when staying mattered. Samuel's oldest daughter, Emma, showed particular interest in herbalism. At 16, she was bright and determined, reminding both Zachary and Adelaide of a young Adelaide setting out to make her own way in the world. She began spending entire summers with them, learning everything they could teach her, and Adelaide saw in her the continuation of everything she had built. "She will be better than I was," Adelaide said one evening, watching Emma carefully prepare a salve. "She has all my knowledge plus Samuel's medical training. She will do things I could only dream of." "You started with nothing and built an empire of healing," Zachary reminded her. "Emma stands on your shoulders. Never diminish what you accomplished." Adelaide smiled at him, the same smile that had captured his heart 30 years earlier. "Our accomplishments, husband. None of this would exist without you." In 1912, Rose gave them their 7th grandchild, a boy they named Zachary after his grandfather. When they placed the infant in Zachary's arms, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility and love, but also something new, a sense of continuity, of his name and legacy extending beyond himself. This child would grow up in a world Zachary could barely imagine, would face challenges and opportunities that did not exist yet, but he would carry forward the values Zachary and Adelaide had tried to embody. "He is perfect," Zachary said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like his namesake," Adelaide said, leaning against him to look at their newest grandchild. "I hope he grows up to be half as good a man as you. I hope he grows up to be twice as good. The world needs all the good men it can get." As young Zachary grew, his grandfather made sure to tell him the story of how he met Adelaide, of the dust storm and the cloth and the decision to stay. It became a family legend, repeated at gatherings and refined with each telling until it took on an almost mythical quality. But the core truth remained. 2 lonely people had found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful. In 1915, the world beyond Pueblo erupted in war. Samuel, too old to be drafted, watched anxiously as young men he had delivered as babies marched off to fight in Europe. Zachary, remembering his own war, felt a deep sadness for the suffering that was coming. But when veterans began returning, damaged in body and spirit, he found new purpose in helping them adjust to civilian life, sharing the hard-won wisdom of someone who had walked that path himself. One young man, shell-shocked and unable to work, came to their house on Rose's recommendation. Zachary spent hours with him, talking through the nightmares and the guilt, teaching him about plants and giving him work in the garden when words failed. Slowly, painfully, the young man began to heal. It was not a cure. Zachary knew there was no cure for what war did to a soul, but it was better. It was survival, and sometimes survival was enough. Adelaide watched him work with the veteran and felt a familiar pride. "You never stopped healing," she said. "Even when we retired, you could not help yourself." "I learned from you," Zachary replied. "You taught me that healing is not just a job, it is who we are." I could no more stop than I could stop breathing. As the 1910s became the 1920s, age began to take its inevitable toll. Zachary's joints ached in the mornings, and Adelaide's eyesight weakened to the point where she needed spectacles for close work. They moved more slowly, tired more easily, but their minds remained sharp, and their love for each other had only deepened with time. They had been married for over 40 years, had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had built a family and a legacy that would outlast them both. Looking back, Zachary sometimes marveled at how much had grown from such a simple beginning. A woman seeing a stranger in trouble. A decision to help. The small daily choice to stay. On their 45th wedding anniversary in 1923, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration. The house was packed with people, noise, and love. Samuel made a toast. Rose cried happy tears, and the grandchildren performed a play they had written about the dust storm, with young Zachary playing his grandfather and Emma playing Adelaide. Watching the children act out that fateful day, seeing his life reflected back at him through the eyes of the next generation, Zachary felt a profound sense of completion. He had done what he set out to do all those years ago when he first picked up Adelaide's shovel. He had repaid the debt. Not through a few days or weeks of work, but through a lifetime of partnership and love. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Zachary and Adelaide lay in their bed, holding hands in the darkness. "You remember what I said to you that first night?" Adelaide asked. "After the storm, you said I was lucky you were terrible at minding your own business." Adelaide laughed softly. "Before that, I said I knew what it was like to be alone, and because I could help, I did. I remember. I want you to know that you ended that loneliness, Zachary. From the moment you stayed, I was never alone again. You gave me that gift, and I have treasured it every day since." Zachary raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You gave me the same gift. You gave me a life worth living. Everything good in my world exists because you wrapped a cloth around my face and refused to let me die. I have spent 45 years being grateful for that, and I will spend however many years I have left feeling exactly the same way." They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, hearts intertwined, two souls who had found each other against all odds and held on through everything life threw at them. The years that followed were gentle ones. They gardened, entertained grandchildren, took slow walks around their property, and enjoyed the luxury of time together without the constant press of work and responsibility. Samuel visited weekly, checking on their health with a doctor's eye and a son's love. Rose brought them meals and gossip from town, keeping them connected to the world beyond their small haven. The grandchildren continued to visit, now bringing great-grandchildren, tiny beings who represented a future so distant Zachary could barely imagine it. In 1927, Adelaide fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly, as it often did, turning a simple cold into something life-threatening within days. Samuel moved them into his house so he could monitor her constantly, and Zachary never left her side. He sat beside her bed for 2 weeks, holding her hand, telling her stories of their life together, refusing to accept that this might be the end. "You have to fight. he whispered when she was too weak to respond. "Remember what you told me. You do not give up, you never give up." Adelaide opened her eyes, focusing on him with difficulty. "Zachary," she breathed, "my love, it is all right." "No, no, it is not all right. I need you. I have always needed you." "You will be fine," she said, each word an effort. "You are strong, stronger than you know." "I am only strong because of you." Adelaide smiled, a shadow of her usual brightness. "Then carry me with you, in your heart. That way I never truly leave." Zachary wanted to argue, to insist that metaphorical presence was not enough, that he needed her physical reality beside him. But he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way each breath was a battle. So instead, he leaned down and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, trying to memorize the feel of her one more time. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for almost 50 years, and I will love you for whatever time I have left." "I love you too," Adelaide whispered. "Thank you for staying." Those were her last words. She slipped into sleep and never woke, passing quietly in the early hours of the morning with Zachary still holding her hand. When Samuel came in to check on her and gently told his father that she was gone, Zachary did not move. He sat there, holding Adelaide's hand, trying to understand how the world could continue when such a fundamental part of it had stopped. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Pueblo. People Adelaide had healed over 5 decades came to pay their respects, sharing stories of her kindness and skill. Former apprentices spoke about her teaching, her patience, her unwavering commitment to helping others. Samuel and Rose delivered tearful eulogies. The grandchildren sang hymns. It was a beautiful tribute to a beautiful life, but Zachary felt hollow through all of it. He went through the motions of receiving condolences, accepting casseroles and kind words, but inside he was lost. For 48 years, Adelaide had been his compass, his anchor, his home. Without her, he was back in that dust storm, unable to breathe, unable to see, completely alone. In the weeks after her death, he moved through his days like a ghost. He stayed with Samuel because his children insisted and he did not have the energy to argue. He ate when food was put in front of him, slept when exhaustion finally dragged him under, but took no real interest in anything. The light had gone out of the world, and he could not figure out how to reignite it. Rose sat with him one afternoon, her own grief evident in her red-rimmed eyes. "Papa, you have to try," she said gently. "Mama would not want you to give up." "I know," Zachary said dully, "but I do not know how to live without her." "Yes, you do. She taught you how. She taught all of us how." Rose took his hand. "You keep going because that is what you do. You survive storms. You rebuild. You stay, even when staying is hard. That is who you are, Papa. That is who she made you." The words penetrated the fog of grief just enough for Zachary to really hear them. Adelaide had not just saved him that day in the dust storm. She had spent nearly 5 decades teaching him how to live, how to love, how to find meaning in service and connection. Everything he was, everything he knew about being a good man, he had learned from her. To give up now would be to discard that legacy, to say that everything she taught him did not matter. He could not do that to her memory. He would not. Slowly, painfully, Zachary began to engage with life again. He moved back to the house he and Adelaide had shared, surrounding himself with her things, her presence. He worked in the garden, planting the flowers she had loved and maintaining the herbs she had cultivated. He spent time with his great-grandchildren, passing on Adelaide's stories and wisdom. He helped Samuel in the clinic when simple tasks needed doing, filing papers and organizing supplies, staying useful in whatever small ways he could manage. It was not the same as having Adelaide beside him. Nothing would ever be the same as that. But it was a life, and it honored her memory, and that was enough. One summer afternoon in 1928, Zachary was working in the garden when he heard a familiar sound, someone coughing violently. He looked up to see a young woman stumbling along the road, dust coating her clothes. There had been a small storm that morning, nothing serious, but clearly enough to cause problems for someone with sensitive lungs. Without thinking, Zachary grabbed a clean cloth, dampened it at the pump, and hurried to her. "Easy now," he said, wrapping the cloth around her face. "Take your time. You are safe." The young woman looked at him with grateful, frightened eyes, and Zachary felt something shift in his chest. This was what Adelaide would have done. This was the lesson she had taught him on the day they met. When you see someone in trouble, you help. You do not calculate costs or expect rewards. You help because you can, because it is the right thing to do, because that is what love looks like in action. He guided the young woman to his porch, made her the mullein tea that had saved his life 50 years earlier, and sat with her until her breathing eased. She tried to pay him, but he refused, just as Adelaide had refused him. "Someone did the same for me once," he explained. "Pass it forward when you can." After she left, Zachary sat on the porch as the sun set, feeling Adelaide's presence more strongly than he had since her death. She was not physically beside him, but she was everywhere, in the garden they had built together, in the knowledge she had taught him, in the act of kindness he had just performed because she had shown him how. "I miss you," he said to the empty air. "Every day I miss you, but I understand now. You are still with me. You will always be with me, and I will keep doing what you taught me until I see you again." The wind stirred the herbs in the garden, carrying their scent across the porch, and Zachary chose to believe it was her answer. He lived for 5 more years, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1933 at the age of 79. His children and grandchildren surrounded him in his final days, making sure he knew he was loved, that his life had mattered, that the example he and Adelaide had set would continue to inspire them. Young Zachary, now a man of 21 studying to be a doctor like his uncle Samuel, promised his grandfather that he would carry on the tradition of healing with compassion. "Make sure they know the story," Zachary whispered from his deathbed. "Make sure they remember how it started. A woman who stayed and a man who learned what that meant." "We will remember," young Zachary promised. "We will always remember." They buried him beside Adelaide in the cemetery overlooking Pueblo under a headstone that read, "Zachary and Adelaide Vance. They stayed." It was simple, but it captured everything that mattered. Their love, their commitment, their choice to build something lasting from a moment of compassion in a dust storm. Years later, decades later, their descendants still told the story. It became family legend, a reminder of where they came from and who they were meant to be. The house Zachary and Adelaide built eventually became a historical site, preserved as an example of frontier healing practices. Adelaide's remedies were studied by modern herbalists and found to be remarkably effective. Zachary's garden still grew, tended by volunteers who wanted to honor their memory. But more than buildings or plants or historical records, what endured was the lesson they had lived. That love is a choice made every day. That staying is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. That one moment of kindness can change everything. They had started with nothing but a dust storm and desperation, and they had built a life that touched hundreds of people across generations. In the end, that was their legacy. Not wealth or fame or grand achievements, but the simple, profound impact of 2 people who chose each other, who worked together, who stayed when staying was hard and loved when loving seemed impossible. They had shown everyone around them what real partnership looked like, what real love meant, and that lesson rippled outward long after they were gone. The dust storm still came to Colorado, turning the sky red and making people cough. But because Zachary and Adelaide had lived, because they had loved, because they had taught others what they learned, fewer people faced those storms alone. Someone always remembered to wrap a cloth around a stranger's face, to guide them to safety, to stay until the danger passed. And in that remembering, in that choosing to help, Zachary and Adelaide's love continued to save lives, just as it had from the very beginning. They had started with a simple act of compassion in the midst of a storm, and they had turned it into something that would never die. The knowledge that we are all connected, that our choices matter, that love, real love, endures everything. That was their gift to the world, and it was more than enough.